Hi and welcome to Academic Compliance Academy of Anti-Money Laundering. So in this video I'm going to talk about risk-based regulation and money laundering. So if we start with the risk-based regulation. Risk-based regulation can be divided into three different types. One that address societal risk, one that address private entity risk, and one that address the kind of public-private systemic risk. So when both of the parties' behavior will accumulate risk but also affect the risk of the other. So we kind of had these different types of risk-based regulation. What can be a bit complex is that typically when we see EU regulation having a risk-based approach or being addressed as being risk-based regulation, all of these three types are kind of connected into one regulatory framework, as it is within the AML area. Because if we look at the 4 AMLD and of course the coming AMLR and AMLD5, well, we can see that these regulatory frameworks include all three different types, because it addresses private entities, it addresses member states also to do risk assessment and mitigating risk, but it also addresses an international, more systemic approach where national member states and private entities need to collaborate, because there is a risk that cannot just be solved within a private entity, within one member state, but demands collaborations. And that type of money laundering risk is the systemic money laundering risk. So we have these three different types, and it's very important when you want to work within compliance in AML that you understand that there are different types of risk, and there are different types of risk-based regulation having different perspective, because it depends on the techniques used for money laundering, the scope, is it national, international, etc., and where does it affect. You can have money laundering cases that are limited within one financial unit and even just a part of the city. That problem might not even really have a large externality effect to society, hence should be mitigated on a risk-based approach by the financial entity. On the contrary, we also have organized crime that goes beyond borders, and here we can see the other level, the systemic risk-based regulation that needs to address this part, and how we between member states and at a EU regional level kind of address our resources in an optimal way to counter these money laundering techniques and procedures. So it's very important that you can see this reflection, and if we put it in an EU context, it is fairly interesting to look at this landscape. So EU designed this model that is presented here. You can find it on their website, and you can see here the structure that the European Union by the blue square represents one perspective. Then you have a member state perspective, and within the member state you have the obliged entities, the national authorities, law enforcement, competent authorities, the FIU, everything, the customers. And depending on the scope where we are, each perspective kind of represents a different type of risk-based regulation, hence a different type of risk that you need to understand if you want to mitigate it. Because if we can say that the risk, the AML, the money laundering risk is what we say limited to be within only hitting one private entity or only one member state, then this should be handled in terms of resources, effective resource allocation within that framework. And that is why we have the risk-based regulation divided into these different perspectives. Because that is maybe not a systemic approach, because it might not involve other member states and be more complex, transboundary, etc. So we need to understand that the risk-based regulation in terms of anti-money laundering, if we want to set up preventive measures, we need to understand what are we fighting at which level and what is necessary for us to succeed. How should the resources be allocated? Are we now in a systemic approach? Then we need to collaborate private-public. Are we only on the public side? Are we doing resource allocation? And then we need to address it like that. And typically, when we have organized crime, it will be a systemic approach we need to take on it. But within the member state, we also need to allocate resources efficiently and tell the private entities how they should address this. So, of course, the more systemic, the higher complexity, and the more difficult it becomes. So just be aware of how this risk-based regulatory system in the AML agenda also affects your preventive measures. And of course, sometimes you cannot see the whole picture, while something at the private entity level might end up being systemic. So you need to always have a certain risk of something being systemic, even though you think that you actually have like closed it in to be a private entity or societal risk. So overall, you need to address this and say, okay, which type of risk-based regulation am I opposed to? Is it national? Is it international? Is it regional? Is it within just one city? Because it matters. So where the effect is matters on which type of regulation and who do you need to collaborate with. How should your resources be allocated in countering this money laundering risk? Also, in that context, is it systemic or is it an isolated event? Is it something that is organized or disorganized? So when we address all of these, because it can be confusing sometimes to read all the AML directives, when we address all of these three types in one, it is because the different risk system, the risk-based approach from everyone, because it's a systemic risk, we need to have the bigger picture, and within this we have different types of risk-based regulations. This is why we put it together. And hence going back to, otherwise this would be only regulated at the member state level, because we know subsidiarity, proportionality. So before the problem becomes international, complex, systemic, these elements cooperate with each other with the legal boundaries on when EU should regulate. So look at risk-based approach, look at money laundering, and understand how the different types of risk-based regulation, depending on the perspective and the scope, really affects your preventive measures. This was just it. It's just a short video on anti-money laundering and how this risk-based regulation, how preventive measures must accommodate which type of risk-based regulation we're actually trying to address. So, well, stay tuned, subscribe to this channel, and let's talk much more about money laundering.